Welcome back to the Mr. Question channel, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready.
Today, we're tackling a question about something really fundamental to democracy, and that's constitutions. Why do we even need them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, can't a country just, run on good vibes and common sense?
Right. Just good intentions.
That's where it gets tricky. Good intentions, they're great, of course, but human history kind of shows us that they aren't always enough. Think of a constitution like the bedrock of a house.
Good.
You might have beautiful walls and furniture, right, but without that solid base, the whole structure is shaky.
So constitutions are about creating that stable foundation for a country, even when things get a little messy, a little tough.
Precisely. And one key element of that foundation that's really important is protecting those individual rights.
Yeah.
It's easy to take those for granted, things like speaking your mind, practicing your religion, just being able to assemble peacefully.
Yeah, absolutely.
But without a constitution that clearly spells those rights out, they become a lot more vulnerable to, the whims of whoever's in power at the moment.
That's so true. It makes you realize how crucial those written guarantees really are. I was actually reading about the case of Fred Korematsu, the Japanese American who challenged internment during World War II.
Yeah.
Even though he lost his case initially, his story, it really highlights how even in those times of crisis, a constitution can give people, citizens, that legal framework to push back against government overreach.
And you know what's really striking about that case? It also kind of demonstrates how constitutions aren't just these static documents. They're not set in stone.
Right.
They're always being reinterpreted, in light of these new challenges that keep popping up. Think about the fight for civil rights, for example. I mean, that movement drew so heavily on those constitutional principles to really demand equality. And each generation faces its own set of, unique challenges that require us to kind of re-examine how those principles apply in this, new context.
So would you say the constitutions are meant to be adaptable? Like they're designed to grow with a nation as its understanding of justice and freedom kind of evolves over time?
Absolutely. They have to adapt. And that actually brings us to another really crucial aspect of these documents, and that's the framework for governance.
Okay.
Constitutions, they lay out that structure of a government, its different branches, the powers that each branch has, and really importantly, how they're supposed to kind of check and balance each other.
It's like designing a game, like a really well-balanced game where everyone knows the rules and no one player can just, dominate the whole thing.
That's a great analogy, actually. Take the U.S. system, for instance. You've got Congress, right, making the laws, the president enforcing them, and then the court stepping in to interpret them. Each branch has its own sphere of authority, but they're also designed to prevent any one of those branches from becoming too powerful.
So it's almost like constitutions are designed to prevent these power grabs, even from leaders who might have good intentions.
That's right. I mean, power, it can be, intoxicating, even for those with the most noble goals. A constitution, it sets those boundaries, right? And it ensures that decisions are made through a process of deliberation and compromise, working together. And this brings us to another really vital element, the rule of law.
Okay, I hear that phrase a lot, rule of law. But what does it actually mean when we put it into practice?
At its core, it means that no one is above the law. Not even those in government. Imagine a scenario where people in power could just make up the rules as they go along. Or even worse, just ignore the rules completely.
Right.
Yeah. That would lead to chaos, total injustice. The rule of law, as it's, enshrined in the Constitution, it ensures predictability and fairness. Everyone is playing by the same set of rules. No one gets special treatment.
So it sounds like constitutions are really all about preventing that kind of arbitrary rule.
Yeah.
Making sure that power is exercised in a way that's predictable, transparent, everyone knows what's going on.
Exactly. And to make that even stronger, constitutions often include these mechanisms that are designed to hold those in power accountable. For instance, we have regular elections.
Right.
They act as a way for citizens to evaluate how their leaders are doing. Are they meeting expectations? Are they actually upholding their end of that constitutional bargain? It's a job performance review.
Totally. It's are you doing what you're supposed to be doing?
Exactly. And then there's another layer of accountability that comes from provisions for transparency. Sometimes they're called sunshine laws. You might have heard that. They basically give citizens access to government information. So, it prevents those shady backroom deals and ensures that decisions are being made out in the open.
So constitutions aren't just about, setting up a government. They're about empowering citizens to participate in the process,
Yeah.
holding their leaders accountable.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, how did these documents come to be in the first place? Like, who decides what goes into them?
That's where it gets really interesting. It varies, of course, from country to country.
Sure.
But it often involves a mix of, legal scholars, elected officials, and really importantly, the voice of the people.
Yeah.
Constitutions, they aren't meant to be decrees that are just handed down from on high,
Right.
They're meant to reflect the values and aspirations of the society that they govern.
So how do ordinary people actually get a say in shaping a document as important as a constitution?
Well, take the example of the U.S. Bill of Rights. That wasn't actually part of the original document. It was added later because citizens demanded stronger protections for their individual liberties. And you know what?
Right.
It shows how a constitution can evolve over time to better reflect, the needs and the concerns of the people.
So it's almost like this constant conversation between those in power and the people they represent, all striving to create, a more perfect union.
That's a great way to put it.
Thanks.
But even with, the absolute best designed constitution, things aren't always smooth sailing,
Yeah.
There can be disagreements about interpretation, power struggles between those different branches of government, and, sometimes you even have moments where the very foundation of a nation's legal order is tested.
Right.
We call those moments constitutional crises.
Ooh, constitutional crises. That sounds pretty ominous. What kind of situations would actually lead to something like that?
Well, imagine a scenario where a president refuses to leave office after losing an election. Or maybe you have a legislature that tries to pass laws that just blatantly violate those fundamental rights we were talking about before.
Yeah.
These situations, they can create a real clash between those different branches of government, and it can leave the nation in a really, really uncertain kind of shaky territory.
Okay, so that's definitely unsettling to consider. So how are these crises typically resolved? Do constitutions offer any guidance at all for those kind of situations?
Sometimes they do, but it's, almost never a simple fix. Constitutions, they might outline procedures like impeachment, judicial review, even sometimes amendments. But resolving those crises, it often requires a blend of legal interpretation, political negotiation, and importantly, public pressure.
So it sounds like these crises really put the strength and adaptability of a constitution to the test. Are there any, historical examples of these situations playing out that we can, look at?
Oh, absolutely. The United States, with its long history, has faced several constitutional crises. A prime example would be the Civil War. At its heart, it was a conflict over the interpretation of the Constitution, specifically the balance of power between that federal government and the individual states.
Yeah, that's a stark reminder of how high the stakes can be when you have those constitutional principles that are at odds with each other. It makes you realize how even systems of governance that seem really, really solid can be, shaken to their core.
You're absolutely right. And that's why it's so crucial for each generation to really understand its constitution, to be vigilant about protecting those principles, and to engage in that constructive dialogue when those principles are challenged. Because the Constitution is only as strong as the people who are actually upholding it.
Well said. So while a constitution provides that framework, it's really up to every generation to kind of breathe life into it, make sure that it remains this living, evolving document that reflects the best of their values and aspirations.
I agree.
But before we, delve deeper into those historical examples, I want to circle back to something we were talking about earlier, and that was those sunshine laws, the ones that are all about transparency.
Ah, yes. Sunshine laws, such a crucial mechanism for holding governments accountable and making sure that they operate in the open. We talked about their theoretical importance, but now I think it's time to explore some real-world examples of how those laws have actually been put into action, sometimes even against some pretty powerful forces.
Ooh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I'm ready to dive into those examples and see how these sunshine laws have actually played out in the real world.
Let's do it.
So we were just talking about these sunshine laws and how they're all about, holding governments accountable.
Yeah.
Can you give us some real world examples? How have these laws actually been used? Maybe even cases where they've been challenged.
Absolutely. There's actually this fascinating case from Missouri, Elad Gross v. Michael Parson. It really highlights this tension. It involved a citizen journalist who was trying to get his hands on public records from the governor's office. But the governor's office, they tried to charge these insane fees for the records. Essentially, they were making it, pretty much impossible for him to actually access the information.
Wow. So they were trying to use like financial barriers to prevent transparency. What happened?
Well, the court, they ended up ruling in favor of the journalists. They basically said those crazy fees were a total violation of the state's sunshine law. It really reinforced this idea that citizens, they have a right to access government information, and they shouldn't have to face these unreasonable financial hurdles to get it.
It's a big win for transparency. It shows how those laws can empower people, regular citizens, to hold even really powerful officials accountable.
Exactly. And this principle, it extends even to the highest levels of government, too. You might remember that case, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington v. Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing about that.
A watchdog group, they sued then President Trump. They were alleging that he had violated the emoluments clause of the Constitution.
Okay, remind me, what was that clause all about again?
It's the one that basically says federal officials, they can't accept gifts or payments from foreign governments without Congress approving it first.
Yeah, right.
The lawsuit was arguing that Trump's business dealings, especially with foreign entities, had violated that clause.
So they were using those sunshine laws to investigate like potential conflicts of interest, even at the presidential level.
Exactly. While that particular case, it didn't actually succeed in court, it did bring to light the importance of transparency, especially when we're talking about those financial dealings and potential conflicts of interest from, the people in those high offices.
Yeah. It's almost like having this legal tool that allows citizens to shine a light into the shadowy corners of government, even at the very top. But if someone actually wants to use these sunshine laws, like how do they go about it? Is it as simple as just, asking for information?
It's rarely that straightforward, unfortunately. Most countries, they have these specific procedures for, requesting access to government records. It often involves these formal requests, deadlines, all that kind of stuff. But the good news is that there are tons of organizations and online resources that can help guide people through that whole process.
So knowing your rights and, how to actually use them is key here.
Yeah.
But are there any, downsides to these sunshine laws? Are there challenges to implementing them? I mean, is there ever a situation where too much transparency could actually be a bad thing?
That's a really, really important point. I mean, yes, transparency, it's generally a positive thing, but it's not without its challenges. Governments, they need to find that right balance between, openness and protecting sensitive information, things like, personal data or national security secrets. We don't want everything out in the open all the time.
Right. It's like a balancing act. We want to keep things open and accountable, but we also got to safeguard those legitimate security concerns.
Exactly. And then there's the practical challenge, too, of just managing that sheer volume of information that governments generate.
Right.
I mean, think about it. With the rise of digital technology, the amount of data, it's just exploded. Processing all those requests for information, it can be so time-consuming and expensive, especially for those smaller government entities that maybe don't have a ton of resources.
It's not just about wanting to be transparent. It's about actually having the capacity to manage all that information and provide access in a way that's timely and efficient.
Exactly. And this is where, technology can play a really crucial role. We're seeing governments invest more and more in those digital tools and platforms that can streamline that whole process of handling public records requests.
It sounds like a constant race to keep up with that evolving world of information technology.
It is.
But I'm curious, amidst all these technological advancements and everything changing so rapidly, do you think the fundamental principles behind those sunshine laws are still as relevant as they were decades ago?
Oh, absolutely. The core idea behind sunshine laws, that governments should operate in the open and they should be accountable to the people they serve, that's a timeless principle. In fact, you could argue that it's even more relevant today in our current age of information overload and all this misinformation flying around.
So ensuring transparency, it's not just about good governance, it's also about fostering trust and informed civic engagement.
Exactly. When citizens have access to information about how their government is actually functioning, they're able to make much more informed decisions, hold their leaders accountable, and participate in the democratic process in a more meaningful way.
We've talked a lot about the U.S. system here, but are there examples from other countries where sunshine laws have played a significant role in promoting that transparency and accountability?
Oh, there are tons of examples from all around the world. In Sweden, for instance, they have this long tradition of offentlighetsprincipen, which basically translates to the principle of public access. It gives citizens the right to access a huge range of government documents and information. And that's been absolutely instrumental in fostering a culture of openness and accountability in Swedish governance.
So the idea of sunshine laws isn't limited to just the United States. It's a principle that's embraced by democracies all over the world.
Exactly. And it can take on all these different forms depending on the country's specific legal system and their own political culture. In some places, like South Africa, for example, they've even established these independent bodies that are dedicated to promoting access to information and investigating complaints about government secrecy.
It sounds like those sunshine laws, in all their different forms, play a vital role in supporting a healthy and vibrant democracy, no matter where you are in the world.
I couldn't agree more. They provide a crucial check on power, ensure that governments are actually operating in the best interests of the people, and, really importantly, empower citizens to participate in shaping their own societies.
Okay, so we've explored that theory behind sunshine laws. We've seen some real-world cases of how they play out. I kind of want to shift gears a little bit, go back to that historical evolution of constitutions. We were talking earlier about those constitutional crises, those moments where the very foundations of a nation's legal order are shaken.
Ah, yes, those pivotal moments where those constitutional principles are truly put to the ultimate test.
Right.
It's time to dig into some of those historical examples and see what lessons we can learn from them.
I'm ready. Let's dive deep into those historical depths and see how constitutions have weathered the storms of, political upheaval and societal change.
Let's go.
We've been talking about how those constitutions can face some really serious challenges, those constitutional crises that really test a nation's commitment to its own core principles. Have you got any, gripping historical examples for us?
Oh, history is full of them. The United States, for instance, it had its own reckoning with slavery. Even though, the Founding Fathers, they crafted this document that was dedicated to liberty, a lot of them were, slaveholders themselves.
Yeah?
That contradiction, it was woven into the very fabric of the Constitution.
It's a stark reminder that even, the most brilliant minds can be products of their time, kind of blind to those injustices that seem so obvious to us now. How did they, reconcile that contradiction when they were actually drafting the Constitution?
Well, it led to some of the most contentious debates and compromises. Take the 3/5 clause, for example.
Right.
It counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for, representation and taxation.
Mm-hmm.
A deeply flawed compromise, for sure. But it really reflects those deep divisions of the time.
Pretty dark chapter in American history, showing how a document that's supposed to embody freedom could also contain, the seeds of oppression.
And it highlights the importance of remembering that constitutions, they're not, these static, perfect entities. They reflect the values and sometimes, the prejudices of their time. But the beauty of a well-crafted constitution is that it can be amended. It can evolve.
So the U.S. Constitution, it didn't just magically fix the issue of slavery overnight.
Not at all. It took a long and bloody civil war, followed by a whole series of amendments to finally abolish slavery and begin that, long process of striving for racial equality. The 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to, formerly enslaved people. Those are testaments to that struggle.
And those amendments, they weren't just legal pronouncements. They were hard-won victories, fueled by the courage and the sacrifice of so many people.
Absolutely. And that fight for equality, it didn't end there. You have the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. That was another huge milestone. And it was achieved after decades of activism by those suffragists who refused to be silenced. These amendments, they demonstrate that a constitution can and should adapt to reflect the changing values and demands of society.
It's almost like this constant dialogue between the past and the present, all trying to shape a better future. So these amendments, they weren't just about fixing those past mistakes. They were about expanding that circle of inclusion and pushing the nation closer to its ideals.
Exactly. And that process, it's still continuing today. The struggle for LGBTQ plus rights, for instance, has led to these legal and societal shifts that are continuing to shape how we understand and interpret those constitutional guarantees of equality and liberty.
It's inspiring to think about how ordinary people, through their activism and persistence, have contributed to the evolution of such a fundamental document.
It really is. It reminds us that a constitution's power ultimately lies in the people who embrace it, defend it, and, really importantly, push it to live up to its highest aspirations.
This deep dive has been, incredibly eye-opening. We've covered so much, from those core principles of constitutions to the ways that they've been tested and transformed throughout history. Is there, one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the biggest one is this. Constitutions, they matter. They define who we are as a society, what we believe in, how we choose to govern ourselves. They protect those fundamental rights. They ensure a framework for, just governance. And they empower us to hold our leaders accountable.
They're not just like dusty old documents sitting on a shelf somewhere.
Nope.
They're living blueprints for a free and fair society, constantly evolving to meet the challenges of each new generation.
Exactly. So stay informed, stay engaged, and whatever you do, don't take those constitutional rights for granted. They're the legacy of all those who fought for a better world, and it's our responsibility to, safeguard and uphold them for those future generations.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we want to thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of constitutions.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a more just and equitable world for everyone.
And may your deep dives always be filled with those insightful discoveries.
See you next time.